Well, that's different. Hey guys, and welcome back to another Random Distractions Home Theater Update video. In a previous video, I did an unboxing and overview of the Buckeye Amps Purified 3-channel amp. And in this video, I'm going to go over the installation and also kind of what my thoughts are on it after having it for about 2 weeks now. So first, I will quickly go over the installation for my setup. The first step was to move the TV stand forward so I could get to the back. While I was back there, I decided to finally remove the Atmos module speaker cables that were connected to the receiver, but not to the speakers since I didn't have those out-firing speakers anymore. They were part of my old Pioneer set. In addition to that, I needed better access to the amp section, so cut out a bigger hole on the back. The space in the front can hold the new amp, but it has a little lip that makes it hard for me to insert it, so in order to get it in there, I put a piece of carpet on the Emotiva amp and remove the feet from the Buckeye amp. Once in place, I put the legs back on the front and the back. I was then able to remove the piece of carpet. Next, I unplugged the RCA cables for the left, center, and right from the Emotiva and unplugged the speaker cables as well. From the Anthem, I unplugged those same RCA cables for the left, center, and right channel. With that, I was able to plug in the new XLR to RCA cables. First, the RCA cable end to the Anthem. I then routed the cables to the amp, velcroing as I went, and hooked up the XLR part to the Buckeye amp. The Buckeye amp has 3 gain settings, so I moved the switches to the high gain setting. After that, I plugged in the speaker cables to the Buckeye amp. It was time to route the power cable, and I was surprised at how short it was. But plugged it into the power strip after moving some stuff around. Once that was done, I was able to move the TV stand back in place. As you can see, the amp is smaller than the Basics, but they fit well in the space. It took a little time, but having everything labeled and somewhat managed back there really helped to make it go smoothly, and luckily everything turned on and was working as it should. Before removing everything though, I did record a little sound clip with the Emotiva, and also after I put everything in place with the Buckeye amp, and the Anthem was set at the same volume level, which was -25, and this was only running the front stage, so the left and right tower and the center channel speaker, so they were running at full range. Here are those clips. As you can see, the Emotiva is louder, but I think that may be due to the gain settings, as well as, and I learned this later on from Dylan, is that when you go from XLR to RCA, it does lower the volume a little bit. But for example, the Emotiva, per their website, their gain setting is set at 29, whereas the Buckeye only has a maximum high gain of 25.5. One other thing that I did before removing the Emotiva was also recording me turning up the volume until it went into protection mode to kind of see where it goes off. And then after I installed the Buckeye, I did the same thing as well, turning up the volume as loud as I could. And so here are those clips. As you can see, the Emotiva gets to -10 on the anthem, and it'll play for a little bit, but then when the song restarts again and that loud part comes in for the first time, it just goes into protection mode. When I did this with the Buckeye amp, and I tried to zoom in on the light, but it's a little bit hard to see, I think, in the video. But it would get to that same level and it wouldn't shut down, but it would start blinking. And I'm not sure if it's blinking because there's an error or if it's clipping. I think it's supposed to turn orange if it's clipping, and red if there's an error. But it happened so fast, but pretty consistently that, I wasn't able to tell what the exact color was, but I'm assuming that it was clipping. However, I didn't really want to push it any harder because I didn't want to damage the amp or my speakers. So I went ahead and turned it down shortly after seeing that it was starting to blink. But it is important to note that even though it was blinking, it was not shutting down. It was still playing the song, and so it was still going. And of course, this is with the front stage running at full range. That was just one test track though, and I still needed to run Arc Genesis, which I did, and I actually noticed a few things. First, the target level was lower than before, and I'm assuming that this is probably due to that gain setting or maybe the XLR to RCA cable thing, but it was lower than what my Emotiva was. However, the graphs, when you compare like the speakers to each other, were very similar. However, what was really baffling was the speaker levels. In my old setup, the front stage was 8, 5.5, and 8.5, whereas for the Buckeye amp, it's only 5, 3, and 5.5. I was thinking that they would be bumped up even more because the volume was lower. My only theory is that because the target level was lower, maybe it just didn't need to rise up much higher to get to that lower target level. These surrounds, which are still run by the Emotiva, were actually turned out quite a bit. So at least I don't have the problem of the Anthem raising the levels really high. The second thing I noticed is when it came to the subwoofers. So if you've watched any of my previous videos, you'll know that the way that I go about setting up the subwoofer level is starting at -15 in the SVS app, and then when Arc Genesis starts running, it'll tell me, hey, it's too loud, can you turn it down? And I turn it down slowly until it finally lets me go through. With that process, the previous setup, my left sub was at -22 and my right sub was at -26. However, this time, my left sub ended up being at -25 and my right sub at -28. Again, my working theory is that it's possibly due to the lower target level. The third thing is the room gain. As I've mentioned before in previous videos, I've come to the conclusion that adding a 3 dB boost to the room gain as a final adjustment is what I actually prefer out of the system. In my previous setup, the room gain ended up being at 2.625, and so I bumped it up to 5.625. This time, the room gain ended up being at 3 dB, so I bumped it up to 6 dB. If you're familiar with Arc Genesis, you know that this is the highest that it can go. This means that depending on how it sounded, if I wanted to get more bass out of the system, I would have to try to find some other sort of adjustment. After running Arc Genesis, I went ahead and tried to push the system again because now the crossovers were in place for the front stage, and so I figured that I might be able to get a little bit more out of it. However, I got to that same volume level and it started blinking again. I decided to reach out to Dylan from Buckeye Amps just to check and see if maybe I was missing something or if this was expected behavior. After all, the speakers were hitting 90 to 100 dBs on average at those levels. While I was waiting for his reply, the one thing that I did think of was because that power cable was so short, I had to plug it into the power strip, and I got everything else, plugged into that, including the TV, the receiver. Actually, one of the subs is connected to that as well. And so I thought, well, maybe I could get a longer cable and plug it directly at least to the wall outlet so it doesn't have to go through the power strip. So I went ahead and ordered one from Amazon for that. I didn't have to wait long actually for Dylan to respond. He got to me later that same day, and he stated that it sounded like everything was working as it should. The only thing that he thought of was possibly that the MRX was not being able to provide enough output voltage at the higher volumes, which could be causing the clipping. I did receive the power cable the next day though, and I was able to replace it, and I tried again to push it, and I was still getting that blinking light, but at least now I knew that that's what was to be expected. And even though I didn't get a very expensive power cable, I like the look of what this one looks like. I know it doesn't add anything to the sound or anything like that, but it looks pretty cool. So up to this point, you're probably thinking to yourself, oh man, you made a bad choice. And to be honest, up to this point, I was kind of wondering the same thing myself. However, I still needed to watch a couple of different movie clips and also listen to some music to see if I could hear a difference. Well, I did hear a difference, but it was in a very, very good way. The first thing I thought of is, how is it that the levels are lower, but I'm actually hearing more from my speakers? I thought I was already hearing more out of my system, but whether it was in a 5.2 configuration or a 2.2 configuration, using this amp, there was just a lot more detail to everything. When listening to music in the 2.2 configuration, the soundstage was much bigger. There was a lot better separation from the instruments and a lot more detail to those instruments. There were songs that I have listened to before, but this time the bass was much more nuanced, and there was also some sort of like texture to the bass, which I had not heard before. And it wasn't just that the soundstage was wider, it also was a lot deeper. So there was things that were a little bit further back now than what they were before, but they still sounded, correct and very detailed. And then there was other things that were really seemed a lot more forward than before. For example, like vocals. Before they would be coming from the front and in the middle, but they almost seemed like they were coming from where the speakers were or the television was. Whereas now it almost seemed like they were almost like in front of me for certain songs, but for most songs they were just a little bit in front of the TV instead. I hope I'm explaining this right, but needless to say, I was really happy with the results. This was the same case for movies, and one thing that surprised me is that even though the surrounds were turned down a little bit more, the integration between the front stage now seemed to be a lot better. For whatever reason, they just seem to be more active, and I don't know if it's because the Emotiva was now just running those two speakers, and so before when it was running everything, it was only, being able to put out a maximum of 95 watts to each channel, whereas for the two speakers, it can now do 120 watts to each speaker and possibly more. So I don't know if that's what it was, but it definitely sounded much better, and it made it feel much more immersive. As for the lower target level, it's actually not that bad. I tried listening to something at the higher volume just before it starts blinking, and it was actually a little bit too much, so I had to turn it down. While I only have the Emotiva Basics A5 as a comparison, I was really pleasantly surprised by what the Purifi version of the Buckeye Amp was able to do. Because of that, I'm actually thinking of getting a second unit, but this time a 2-channel version, which I would use to power the front towers, the left and the right tower, and then have the 3-channel power the center and then the surrounds. That is, of course, unless I find something else that I need to get instead. Before I forget, if you do follow the Audio Science Review Forum, which is where I heard about Buckeye Amps in the first place, they did do a review on the Purifi amps, and they found an issue with rising distortion, which is not found in other amps that use those same Purifi modules. Dylan with Buckeye Amps is aware and is working on a fix, but in actual practice it doesn't really seem to affect it much. From my personal experience, I didn't notice any distortion issues. Even when it was blinking, I didn't really hear anything weird. I just, I didn't want to push it too hard, so it turned it down pretty quickly after that, but I didn't notice anything. If anything, it's more detailed than what the Emotiva was, so it's working great. From what I understand, once the fix is found, they're going to, of course, implement it into any new orders, but anybody that's already ordered one, like myself, will be reached out to provide whatever the fix is. Once that happens, I'll go ahead and release an updated video to see if any difference was noted. Before I close out, I wanted to mention that I'm finally moving into the world of height speakers, but not in a conventional way. However, I'm looking forward to see what this Atmos craze is all about. Well, that's all that I have for this video. I would definitely appreciate a like course on this one, and make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell to be notified when the next one drops. Leave me any comments or questions that you have about the Buckeye amp, and I'll see if I can answer them. But until then, I hope you have a good one.